What happens when the provocations between her and the millionaire spiral out of control? One kiss born from jealousy changed everything. Forever. Tell me, where are you watching from? If you want to find out how this passionate story ends, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. You won't regret it. The kiss happened in the middle of the most important party of the year, in front of 200 people, when Adelaide should have been serving New England champagne, and Griffin should have been announcing his engagement. But in that moment, with his lips on hers and the shocked silence taking over the Federalist-style ballroom, nothing mattered beyond the truth they had both denied for months: the daily provocations, the insults disguised as jokes, the arguments that made the staff retreat. All of it was merely a disguise for an attraction that burned like embers hidden beneath ashes. Time stood still. Crystal glasses hung suspended in the air. Conversations faded like candles caught in a southern breeze. No one breathed, not even Sloane, who watched the scene from the small, improvised stage, her Italian silk dress now a second skin that seemed to suffocate her. Sometimes the heart finds its truth precisely when a lie was about to be sealed with gold and empty promises, thought Adelaide, as she felt Griffin's hands clasp her waist as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. But to understand how they reached this precise moment, we must go back 8 months, when destiny, or perhaps determination, brought Adelaide to the wrought-iron gates of that mansion in the Vermont hills, where the mountain winds kissed the earth with the same intensity with which Griffin now kissed her lips. The New England sun beat down mercilessly on the gravel path when Adelaide Montgomery crossed the imposing gates of Hemlock Estate. The breeze carried the penetrating scent of pine and hydrangeas, but she hardly noticed. Her amber eyes, determined and vigilant, scrutinized the white facade of the Vermont mansion with the precision of someone seeking answers in every crack, in every window with its wrought-iron grating. "So this is what one buys with other people's money?" she murmured to herself, adjusting the strap of her worn suitcase over her shoulder. The weight of the documents hidden in the lining of her luggage seemed to multiply with each step she took, along the path flanked by century-old hemlocks. Whitaker, the butler with a face weathered by decades under the northeastern sun, watched her from the main entrance. His eyes, small and shrewd like those of an old fox, catalogued every detail of the newcomer, from her worn shoes to her erect posture that contrasted with the apparent humility of her attire. "Miss Montgomery, welcome to Hemlock Estate," he greeted with a formality that sounded like a warning. "Mr. Blackwood will receive you shortly. Meanwhile, I'll show you to your quarters." Adelaide nodded, following the man down marble corridors that told stories of an opulence she found offensive. Each painting, each piece of colonial pottery, each wrought-iron lamp seemed to whisper to her that she was in enemy territory. But she hadn't come here to admire luxuries. She had come to reclaim what rightfully belonged to her. "Your responsibilities will begin tomorrow at 6, explained Whitaker as he opened the door to a surprisingly spacious room for a staff member. "The master is very strict about punctuality and protocol, especially with breakfast coffee." "I know how to make coffee, Mr. Whitaker," she replied with a hint of southern pride that didn't escape the butler. "The best, Mr. Blackwood has ever tasted." An almost imperceptible smile formed on the old man's lips. "That remains to be seen, Miss Montgomery. Many have made that claim before meeting the master." When she was alone, Adelaide allowed herself a moment of weakness. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers caressing the Egyptian cotton quilt, and contemplated the small balcony that offered a partial view of the Green Mountains. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but for her, every corner was stained with the invisible ink of injustice. 5 years, she whispered, taking a crumpled photograph from her pocket. The image showed a humble but beautiful house on the hills of Savannah, with her grandmother smiling from the small herb garden. 5 years looking for you, and now I'm in the house of the man who took you from us." The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway made her hastily tuck away the photograph. She took a deep breath, preparing for the encounter she had mentally rehearsed for weeks. But nothing could have prepared her for the presence that crossed the threshold seconds later. Griffin Blackwood descended the oak staircase with the arrogance of someone who never had to ask for anything twice. His Armani suit fit his athletic body perfectly, like a second skin designed to intimidate. But it was his eyes that captured Adelaide's attention, dark as coffee beans, penetrating, assessing every inch of her with an intensity that was almost physical. "So you're the new housekeeper," he pronounced in perfect English with a faint Boston accent that stretched certain vowels. It wasn't a question, but a statement loaded with skepticism. "Adelaide Montgomery," she introduced herself, extending a hand that he looked at as if it were a strange object before briefly shaking it. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Blackwood." Griffin's lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the calculated coldness of his eyes. "Opportunity, Miss Montgomery, is something earned, not given. I hope your skills compensate for what you evidently lack in presentation." His gaze deliberately descended to Adelaide's worn shoes, then back to her face with an expression that mixed disdain with morbid curiosity. Something inside Adelaide, something ancient and fierce that she thought she had tamed, awakened from its slumber. She stood imperceptibly taller, and when she spoke her voice had the clarity of water from southern springs. "In the South, Mr. Blackwood, we learn that a person's worth isn't measured by the price of their footwear, but by the strength of their character. But I understand that certain Northeastern perspectives might confuse money with class." A stunned silence settled in the foyer. Whitaker, who observed from a discreet distance, held his breath. No one in the 3 years he had worked at Hemlock Estate had dared speak to the master like that. To everyone's surprise, including Adelaide's, Griffin didn't explode in fury. Instead, a spark of something like respect, or perhaps recognition of a worthy adversary, flashed in his eyes before being quickly suppressed. "Interesting theory," he responded with studied calm. "Let's see if your character also compensates for your accent. I expect breakfast at 7 sharp. Colombian coffee, not that over-roasted blend so popular in the South." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving in his wake a trail of expensive cologne and electric tension. "No one has survived more than 2 months speaking to him like that," commented Whitaker when Griffin disappeared into his study. There was no reproach in his voice, but something closer to cautious admiration. Adelaide smiled, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "I don't need 2 months, Mr. Whitaker. Just enough time." What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that behind that confrontation was something more than wounded pride. There was a meticulously crafted plan, a promise made at a graveside, and the determination of a woman who had crossed the country not in search of work, but justice. That night, while unpacking her meager belongings, she found a note slipped under her door. In elegant but hurried handwriting, it simply said, "Breakfast is at 7, not at 7:01, not at 6:59. Time is the only luxury that cannot be bought, Miss Montgomery. Do not waste mine." Adelaide crumpled the paper between her fingers, feeling that the battle had barely begun. What she couldn't imagine was that this note would be the first of many, the start of a cold war that concealed fires much more dangerous than hatred. 3 months passed during which Hemlock Estate became the stage for a silent but relentless war. Each morning, Adelaide placed Griffin's coffee exactly at 7 not a minute before or after. And each morning, he found something to criticize. Too strong, too weak, the cup placed incorrectly beside the Egyptian linen napkins. "Real New England coffee has a hint of cinnamon, Miss Montgomery," he would comment in that condescending tone that made her wish to pour the scalding liquid in his lap. Though, perhaps that's a refinement too subtle for palates accustomed to biscuits and gravy. "I regret that my humble Southern knowledge doesn't satisfy your Northeastern demands, sir," she would respond with a smile that contradicted the edge of her words. "Tomorrow I'll include a bit of common sense in the preparation, though I doubt you'd appreciate it." The other staff members, Mrs. Patterson the cook, Hank the gardener, and the maids Lucinda and Melody, observed this daily verbal duel with a mixture of fear and fascination. In kitchen whispers, they speculated about how long it would take the master to fire the new housekeeper, or how long she would endure before quitting with a slam of the door. But what no one could see was how, after each confrontation, both vibrated with a strange energy that wasn't exactly anger. How Griffin, after each sharp exchange, would lock himself in his study with a disconcerting half-smile. How Adelaide, while meticulously organizing the library books alphabetically, when she knew perfectly well he preferred them by subject, felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. During the dinners she served for important guests, tech entrepreneurs from Boston, aristocrats from New York with surnames longer than their bank accounts, he found subtle ways to belittle her service. "My housekeeper has a particular concept of French cutlery arrangement," he would comment with false indulgence. "But what can one expect from someone who probably ate with her hands until she was 20? And she, in response, would accidentally spill ice water near his chair or serve wine with such an abrupt flick of her wrist that a few drops would splash onto the immaculate tablecloth, forcing him to disguise his irritation in front of the diners. One particularly tense afternoon, while Adelaide was polishing silver in the main dining room, she overheard a conversation not meant for her ears. Griffin was speaking on the phone in his adjacent study, with the door ajar, his voice oscillating between frustration and something resembling pleading. "I can't sell now, Harrison. Yes, I understand the legal implications. No, I haven't located all the legitimate heirs yet. Do you think I don't know? I've been trying to undo this mess for 5 years. Adelaide froze, the polishing cloth suspended in mid-air. Those words confirmed her suspicions. Griffin Blackwood was involved in the fraudulent sale of her grandmother's house, that small jewel on the hills of Savannah that had been snatched from her family, taking advantage of the old woman's illness and financial desperation during the recession. What didn't fit was that trying to undo. What did it mean? Could the arrogant northeastern businessman actually have remorse? The idea seemed as improbable as snow in August in Georgia. That night, while reviewing the hidden documents in her room, old deeds, newspaper clippings about suspicious sales of historic properties during the recession, photographs of meetings between Griffin and notaries from Savannah, Adelaide felt that something didn't add up in the image she had constructed of the man she had come to confront. "Don't let yourself be fooled," she said aloud. "Men like him don't have conscience, only strategies." But when the next day she found a pair of new shoes on her bed, elegant but discreet, with a note that simply said, "To better match your strong character, Miss Montgomery," something uncomfortable stirred within her. It wasn't just indignation at what could be interpreted as charity. It was confusion, and perhaps most dangerously, curiosity. Instead of thanking him for the gift or returning it indignantly, she opted for a third path. She placed the shoes perfectly aligned in front of his study door, alongside a bottle of the finest peach preserves from her native Georgia, and a note written in her clear, decisive handwriting. "In the South, Mr. Blackwood, gifts are given from heart to heart, not from pocket to foot. Keep your northeastern shoes. I'll keep my southern dignity." What she couldn't foresee was that night, alone in his study, Griffin would hold the jar of preserves against the light, observing its amber color, as if it contained answers to questions he didn't yet dare formulate. Nor that he would taste a drop on his finger, closing his eyes at the explosion of flavor that would remind him there were riches that couldn't be bought with all the money in New England. The 5th month arrived accompanied by a nor'easter, that cold, disturbing wind that blows from the Atlantic and alters nerves, awakens dormant passions, and tears down invisible walls. Hemlock Estate seemed to vibrate under its influence. Curtains undulated like restless ghosts, servants were more irritable, and even the garden birds sang with an unknown urgency. It was precisely during a nor'easter afternoon when the first real fracture in Griffin's armor occurred. Adelaide found him in the library, that sanctuary lined with noble wood where first editions of Hemingway, Faulkner, and Whitman were aligned, sitting on the floor among scattered books, holding an old photograph with slightly trembling hands. Upon sensing her presence, he quickly put the image away, but not before she saw enough. A skinny boy with big, sad eyes, smiling timidly next to a woman with a tired but dignified face, in front of a deteriorated building she immediately recognized as part of the Brooklyn neighborhood of Brownsville. "Do you need something, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, with a harshness that failed to disguise his newly exposed vulnerability. Adelaide should have taken advantage of this moment of weakness for her benefit, to advance her plan to unmask him. Instead, something in the momentary fragility of this man she thought she knew touched an unexpected fiber within her. "I came to ask if you prefer tea or coffee for the meeting with the Boston investors," she responded, pretending not to have seen anything significant. "The nor'easter tends to affect appetite but stimulates thirst." Griffin looked at her for a long time, as if trying to determine whether her discretion was genuine or calculated. Finally, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he answered, "Green tea, with orange blossom honey if we have it." "We do," she nodded, and after a brief pause added, "My grandmother always said that strong winds bring memories we thought were buried. that we shouldn't fight against it, but let it blow until it passes. For a moment it seemed Griffin would share something personal, something real. The invisible wall between employer and employee, between northerner and southerner, between supposed villain and supposed victim, thinned almost to disappearing. But then his phone rang, breaking the spell of the moment. "You'd better prepare that tea," he said, returning to his professional tone as he stood and smoothed imaginary wrinkles from his impeccable suit. Adelaide nodded and headed toward the door, but before leaving she paused, giving him her back to avoid facing her own audacity. "Brownsville is one of my favorite Brooklyn neighborhoods," she commented, as if discussing the weather. "It has a soul that rich neighborhoods could never buy." And she left without waiting for a response, leaving behind a disconcerted Griffin, who once again held the hidden photograph, now with an indecipherable expression on his usually controlled face. That night dinner transpired in an unusual silence. The usual barbs between them gave way to furtive glances loaded with unasked questions. When their fingers accidentally brushed as she passed the platter of prime rib, neither withdrew their hand with the customary speed. The contact lasted only a second longer than necessary, but it was enough for both to feel an electric current that had nothing to do with the nor'easter. "The roast is exceptional tonight," he commented, breaking the silence. "Did you prepare it?" "The recipe is Mrs. Patterson's," Adelaide replied, surprised by the compliment. "But I added a personal touch, southern herbs marinated in Vermont maple syrup." A genuine smile, the first since her arrival, briefly illuminated Griffin's face. "The South and North in perfect harmony, who would have thought?" "The most intense rivalries often hide deep affinities," she responded, instantly regretting the ambiguity of her words. That night, while the nor'easter howled around Hemlock Estate like a wounded animal, Adelaide lay awake in her bed, contemplating the ceiling and wondering what had changed. The image of the Brownsville boy superimposed in her mind with the current Griffin, powerful, arrogant, seemingly invulnerable. How had he transformed poverty into empire? And why didn't this transformation reassure her, but rather complicated her feelings toward him even further? Because she had to admit, they were no longer just feelings of resentment or justice. There was something more, something murky and dangerous growing between them with each provocation, with each gaze held a second longer than necessary, with each silence loaded with unspoken words. The wind finally abated at dawn, but Adelaide's inner storm was just beginning. And when she found on her nightstand a small volume of poems by Langston Hughes, first edition, bound in red leather, with a simple note that said, "To better understand the Southern soul," she knew she had crossed an invisible line from which there might be no return. "Miss Montgomery, prepare the master suite. We'll have a special guest." Griffin's order, transmitted by Whitaker one June morning, fell like a bucket of cold water on Adelaide. Over the last few weeks, a strange truce had established itself between them. The provocations had lost their venomous edge to transform into an almost complicit game. He would leave books of New England poetry on her bed. She would respond with small vials of Southern essences on his desk. He criticized her coffee with less conviction. She organized his schedule with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic. But now, the news of a special guest altered that delicate balance. "May I ask who the guest is?" she ventured to question while selecting silk sheets for the master bed. Whitaker, always discreet but observant, looked at her with something resembling compassion. "Miss Sloane Harrington, Mr. Blackwood's ex-fiancée, or perhaps soon fiancée again." Adelaide felt as if an invisible hand crushed her heart. Fiancée? Griffin was engaged? None of her previous investigations had revealed this crucial detail. "I understand," she responded with a neutrality that cost every ounce of her self-control. "Any particular preferences of Miss Harrington?" "Allergies to lilies, preference for French champagne over local varieties, ironies of life, and a tendency to reorganize everything to her liking," enumerated Whitaker with a hint of resignation. "Prepare for 2 intense weeks, Miss Montgomery." 2 weeks. 14 days with Griffin's ex, or future, fiancé under the same roof. Adelaide wondered if fate had a particularly cruel sense of humor. Sloane Harrington arrived that same afternoon in a white Mercedes convertible that skidded slightly on the gravel path. Tall, elegant to the point of intimidation, with that type of New York aristocratic beauty that seemed carved in cold marble. Perfect features, jet black hair gathered in an impeccable chignon, and green eyes that evaluated everything with the precision of a jewel appraiser. "Griffin, darling," she exclaimed as she descended from the vehicle with the studied grace of someone who knows she's being watched. The embrace she gave him seemed more like a public exhibition than a gesture of genuine affection. "How absolutely provincial you look. The Vermont sun suits you, though that tan is terribly rustic." Adelaide, who observed from the discreet distance of her role as housekeeper, noticed how Griffin tensed imperceptibly under that comment. Did he dislike having his humble origins mentioned, or was it the condescension in Sloane's tone that bothered him? "Welcome to Hemlock Estate, Sloane," he responded, with a courtesy that sounded rehearsed. "I hope your stay will be revealing." That word, revealing, made Adelaide sharpen her attention. There was something in Griffin's tone, a second intention she couldn't decipher. When Sloane finally noticed her presence, she scanned her from head to toe with the same expression she would use to evaluate a slightly defective piece of furniture. "And this is Adelaide Montgomery, my housekeeper." Griffin introduced her with a neutral tone that contrasted with the way his eyes briefly diverted to her, as if apologizing for something. "Charmed," said Sloane without being so at all. "I hope my preferences have been adequately communicated." "I detest having to repeat things." "Everything is prepared according to your wishes, Miss Harrington," Adelaide responded with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Including the French champagne you prefer over local varieties." A flash of surprise crossed Sloane's perfect face, quickly replaced by a forced smile. "What efficiency! Almost northeastern, I'd say. Where are you from exactly?" "Savannah," Adelaide replied, holding the green gaze without blinking. "Where we learn that true elegance lies in making others feel comfortable, not in impressing them." A tense silence settled in the foyer. Whitaker discreetly coughed. Griffin, to everyone's surprise, let out a genuine laugh that broke the tension like a knife. "I see you're already getting to know each other," he commented, placing a hand on Sloane's waist with a gesture that seemed more intended to guide her away than to show affection. "Adelaide has a special gift for saying exactly what she thinks." "What a peculiar quality for an employee," Sloane responded with a smile that was pure ice. During the following days, Hemlock Estate became the stage for a strange emotional triangle that no one had anticipated. Sloane ostentatiously occupied the role of lady of the house, reorganizing decorations, changing menus, and monopolizing Griffin's attention with endless anecdotes about her failed marriage in Paris to an Italian count, and her plans to open a conceptual art gallery in New York. Griffin, for his part, showed an attitude that Adelaide couldn't decipher. Sometimes he seemed completely absorbed in Sloane, laughing at her elitist jokes and accompanying her on long walks through the hydrangea garden at sunset. Other times, she would catch him observing her, Adelaide, with a disturbing intensity while she served tea or reorganized books in the library. And Adelaide discovered a painful truth: jealousy can be more revealing than any confession. Each time she saw Griffin lean to whisper something in Sloane's ear, each time she heard them planning trips to Milan, or recalling anecdotes from their shared past in New York, she felt a physical pang in her chest that had nothing to do with her original plan of justice and revenge. One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Sloane had casually mentioned 3 times the possibility of resuming their engagement, Adelaide deliberately broke a valuable Wedgwood serving tray. The crash provided the perfect excuse to flee to the garden before anyone noticed the tears that threatened to betray her. Under the arbor covered with jasmine, with the sweet aroma mixing with the mountain breeze, she allowed herself a moment of brutal honesty with herself. It wasn't just justice for her grandmother's house that kept her there. It wasn't just the meticulously crafted plan over years. It was Griffin. The irritating, arrogant, complex, and surprisingly vulnerable Griffin Blackwood, who had gone from being the villain of her story to something much more dangerous, a possibility. "Wedgwood porcelain doesn't grow on hemlock trees, you know." Griffin's voice startled her. He stood a few feet away, his figure silhouetted against the lights of the house, holding 2 glasses of what appeared to be peach brandy. "I'm sorry," she responded, quickly composing herself. "I'll deduct the value from my salary." "Don't be ridiculous," he replied, approaching to offer her one of the glasses. It was a rather mediocre imitation, Sloane brought it from one of her trips to London, convinced it was a museum piece. A complicit silence established itself between them as they savoured the brandy under the starry New England sky. Finally, it was Adelaide who dared to cross the invisible line. "Are you going to marry her?" The question hung in the night air, as direct as it was unexpected. Griffin contemplated the amber contents of his glass for what seemed an eternity. "That's everyone's expectation, isn't it?" he finally responded, with a bitterness that surprised Adelaide. The northeastern businessman and the New York aristocrat. The perfect fusion of capital and influence. "I didn't ask what others expect," she insisted, with a courage fueled by the brandy and the night. "I asked what you're going to do." Griffin looked at her then, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Not the insolent employee, not the proud Southerner, but the woman who had stirred something inside him that he believed well buried under layers of ambition and pragmatism. "What I should do and what I wish to do rarely coincide in my life, Miss Montgomery," he responded, with an honesty that seemed to physically pain him. "It's the price of success." "Sounds more like the price of fear," she replied, instantly regretting her audacity. But instead of taking offense, Griffin smiled with a sadness that transformed his face, making him appear closer to the boy from Brownsville than the real estate magnate. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the boy who grew up with nothing still fears losing everything." That moment of shared vulnerability changed something fundamental between them. It didn't erase the past, didn't resolve the central conflict over the Savannah property, but it created a fragile bridge over the abyss that separated them. When they returned to the house, Sloane observed them from the terrace, her silhouette outlined against the salon lights, a champagne glass in hand and a calculating expression on her beautiful face. And Adelaide knew, with the instinctive certainty of someone who grew up fighting to survive, that she had just gained an unlikely ally in the person of Harper, her best friend from Savannah, who would arrive the next day with documents that could change everything. Harper's blue Prius raised a small cloud of dust as it stopped in front of Hemlock Estate. Adelaide watched from the kitchen window, her heart beating with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Her friend, investigative journalist, housing rights activist, and her accomplice since high school days, brought with her the final piece of the puzzle she had pursued for 5 years. "Adelaide!" exclaimed Harper upon seeing her, embracing her with the effusiveness characteristic of her personality. "My God, look at you! You look like a high society lady in that uniform. And you still look like a revolutionary about to occupy a bank," laughed Adelaide, pointing to the faded T-shirt with the slogan, "They're not suicides, they're evictions," that her friend wore under her worn leather jacket. In Adelaide's small room, with the door closed and the sound of the mountain wind as the only soundtrack, Harper took a worn folder from her backpack. Her eyes shone with the intensity of someone who had found an important truth. "I have everything, Adelaide. Absolutely everything." Spread on the bed were documents, photographs, newspaper clippings, and most importantly, copies of bank transfers that revealed a story completely different from what Adelaide had constructed in her mind over the years. "It wasn't Griffin who defrauded your grandmother," explained Harper, pointing to a series of legal documents. "It was Edmund Harrington, Sloane's father, who orchestrated the entire operation, taking advantage of your grandmother's illness and your family's financial desperation during the recession." Adelaide felt the floor moving beneath her feet. Sloane's father, not Griffin. Had all her vengeance, her meticulous plan, been directed at the wrong person? But then, what role does Griffin play in all this? She asked, trying to reorganize the puzzle in her mind. Harper pointed to a series of printed emails. Griffin bought the property 3 years later, when he discovered irregularities in several acquisitions made by the Harrington Company. And look at this. A notarized document, dated 4 years ago, showed that Griffin had initiated a legal process to investigate the fraudulent sale and locate the legitimate heirs of various properties, including the Savannah house. "He's been looking for you, Adelaide. All this time, while you were planning your revenge against him, he's been trying to find you to return what's rightfully yours." The irony was so overwhelming that Adelaide couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. She collapsed onto the bed, contemplating the documents that completely rewrote her personal narrative. Why didn't he say anything when I appeared here? Why maintain this charade? "Maybe he wanted to be sure of your intentions," suggested Harper, always the voice of reason, or perhaps he had his own plans for the revelation. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was Mrs. Patterson, the cook, informing her that Griffin requested her presence in the central courtyard immediately. Something in her expression alerted Adelaide that this wasn't a routine request. "Put all this away," she instructed Harper. "We'll continue later." The central courtyard, with its colonial fountain and its marble columns, was bathed in the golden light of sunset. The aroma of rosemary and sweet fennel saturated the cool air. Griffin was alone, contemplating the water that fell in a hypnotic geometric pattern, wearing not one of his usual impeccable suits, but simple jeans and a white shirt that gave him an almost vulnerable appearance. "You called for me, sir?" asked Adelaide, maintaining a formality that already seemed out of place between them. Griffin turned to her, and something in his expression told her that everything had changed. In his hand, he held a photograph that she instantly recognized, herself at 10 years old alongside her grandmother, in front of the Savannah house. "I think it's time we end the lies, Adelaide Montgomery Williams, granddaughter of Eleanor Williams, legitimate owner of Magnolia Haven in Savannah." The use of her full name, the mention of her grandmother, the confirmation that he knew exactly who she was from the beginning. Adelaide felt the air leave her lungs. How did I know who you were?" he completed, taking a step forward. "Your job application was too perfect, too convenient. And your eyes, they have the same fire as your grandmother's, when I tried to explain to her that I wanted to help her recover her house a few months before her passing." "You knew my grandmother," murmured Adelaide, not as a question, but as an astonishing revelation. Griffin nodded, his face now softened by the memory. "An extraordinary woman. She reminded me of my own mother, proud, strong, incapable of accepting help, even when she desperately needed it. She threw me out of her hospital room with words that would have made a sailor blush." An involuntary smile formed on Adelaide's lips. That sounded exactly like her grandmother. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" she asked, finally dropping the mask of the submissive employee that had never fit her well. "Why allow me to work for you, to hate you, to plan—" She stopped, aware that she was revealing too much. "To plan your little revenge," he completed with a smile that contained no reproach. "Because I needed time, Adelaide. The legal web that Harrington wove around that property is complex. I've spent 3 years untangling it, and finally, a week ago, I secured the last signature necessary to legally reverse the sale." He took an envelope from his pocket and extended it to her. Inside, Adelaide found a new deed, with her name as the owner of Magnolia Haven. "It's yours," he said simply. "It always was." The tears that Adelaide had contained for weeks, years perhaps, began to flow freely. They weren't tears of pure joy, nor of sadness, but of a complex emotion that encompassed relief, confusion, gratitude, and something more she didn't dare name. "Why?" she asked in a broken voice. "Why go to such trouble for a stranger, for a house you could have sold at an enormous profit?" Griffin looked at her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her to the soul. "Because I grew up watching my mother lose our home in Brownsville to a similar scam. Because I promised that if I ever had power, I'd use it to correct injustices like that. And because—" He paused, as if carefully measuring his next words. "Because, since you arrived here with your southern pride and your sharp responses, you've stirred something in me that I believed dead a long time ago." A silence loaded with meaning settled between them. The colonial fountain continued its eternal song, oblivious to the human drama unfolding around it. Somewhere in the garden, a cardinal began its evening serenade. It was Adelaide who finally spoke, with a sincerity born from the liberation of years of resentment. "I came here hating you, seeking justice, and now—" "And now?" he asked, taking another step closer, so near she could detect the subtle citrus aroma of his cologne. "And now I don't know what to feel," she confessed. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the avenging granddaughter." "You're Adelaide," he responded with surprising tenderness. "The woman who spills hot coffee near my feet when I provoke her. The one who organizes my books alphabetically knowing it drives me crazy. The one who has transformed this cold house into a home with her impossible presence." His words, so sincere, so unexpectedly poetic, coming from a man she had catalogued as cold and calculating, disarmed her last defenses. But before she could respond, a cutting voice like broken crystal interrupted the moment. "What a touching scene! The northeastern businessman and the southern maid, almost cinematic. Sloane stood at the entrance to the courtyard, her slender figure framed by the colonial arch, holding a champagne glass and wearing an elegant black dress that seemed excessively formal for an evening at home. "This is none of your business, Sloane," Griffin responded with a coldness that dramatically contrasted with the warmth he had shown seconds before. "Oh, but it is, darling," she smiled, advancing with calculated steps, "especially when it affects our engagement plans. Or have you forgotten that tomorrow we'll announce our reunion in front of all our friends?" Adelaide felt as if ice water had been thrown on her. Engagement? After all they had just shared? "There will be no engagement announcement," Griffin replied with a firmness that admitted no reply. "The party will go on, but as a presentation of my new sustainable tourism project, nothing more." Sloane's face contorted in a grimace of barely contained fury. "Are you really going to throw away everything we've built for a fling with your housekeeper? What will the board of directors say? What will my father say? Your father should be more concerned about the fraud lawsuits that are about to fall on him than about my personal life," he retorted, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And as for the board of directors, this is my company, not a democracy." Sloane shot a venomous look at Adelaide, who remained still, trying to process the vertiginous turn of events. "This isn't over," she warned, before spinning on her heels and disappearing through the entrance arch. When they were alone again, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. All truths revealed, all cards on the table, and yet uncertainty hung over them both like a storm cloud. "Is it true?" Adelaide finally asked. "Were you going to get engaged to her tomorrow?" Griffin ran a hand over his face, in a gesture of weariness that made him look surprisingly human. "It was the easy path," he confessed. "The expected one. What a good northeastern businessman would do to secure social connections and stability. And now?" Their eyes met, and for the first time since they had known each other, there were no masks between them. Not the businessman and the employee, not the northerner and the southerner, not the supposed villain and the avenger. Just a man and a woman caught in a story that neither had foreseen. "Now," he began but stopped, as if words were insufficient to express the complexity of the situation. "Now we have a party tomorrow, and many decisions to make." The distance between them seemed both infinite and minuscule, both on the edge of something that could change everything, but neither willing to take the final leap. Not yet. "I should get back to Harper," Adelaide said finally, holding against her chest the deed that returned her inheritance. "We have a lot to discuss." Griffin nodded, understanding. "Of course, tomorrow we'll talk." As she walked away, Adelaide felt that she was leaving the courtyard as a completely different person than the one who had entered. The avenger had died, but the woman born from her ashes was still a mystery to herself. And as for Griffin, for the first time in his adult life, the businessman who had built an empire from nothing found himself completely lost, without a plan, without a clear strategy, only with the certainty that, whatever happened at the next day's party, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning of the big party dawned with a deceptive clarity. The Vermont sky, intensely blue, seemed to promise perfection, but Adelaide, who had grown up interpreting the subtle changes in southern air, perceived the distant threat of a storm on the horizon. Harper had departed at dawn after a night of long conversations, where the past, present, and future possibilities blended like colors on an impressionist's palette. The deed to Magnolia Haven now rested in the safe of the Hemlock estate, secure but unsettling in its materiality. The tangible proof that everything Adelaide had fought for was now resolved, leaving her in a vacuum of purpose that was terrifying. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery," Whitaker greeted her as he supervised the arrival of the caterers hired for the event. "Mr. Blackwood has left specific instructions for you." He handed her an envelope with the Hemlock estate letterhead. Inside, Griffin's clear, decisive handwriting indicated, "Today you are not an employee, but a guest. Your presence is requested tonight not to serve, but to share. P.S. In your closet you'll find something I hope will be to your liking." In her room, Adelaide found a large box with the discreet logo of a famous American designer. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, rested a dress that took her breath away. Intense ruby-colored silk, with a cut that combined contemporary elegance with reminiscences of the best Southern style. Beside the dress, a more personal note. The color of northeastern red wine, the shape of Southern grace, Like us. That us, so simple and so loaded with implications, made her heart race. Was she really considering this? A relationship with the man against whom she had harbored resentment for years. But before she could resolve this dilemma, a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. Sloane's voice, shrill with fury, pierced the thick walls of the mansion. "What do you mean, cancelled? You can't do this to me, Griffin. I personally invited the Caldwells, the Mitchells, even the Secretary of Culture. Everyone expects the announcement of our engagement." Griffin's response was inaudible, but the subsequent door slam and sound of breaking glass spoke for themselves. Something had changed since their conversation yesterday, something definitive. The afternoon passed in a state of expectant tension. The staff moved with the caution of those who perceive they are walking on an emotional minefield. Adelaide kept her distance from both Griffin and Sloane, mentally preparing for what she sensed would be a decisive night in her life. At 8 o'clock sharp, Hemlock Estate had transformed. Thousands of small colonial-style lights illuminated the gardens and central courtyard. A string quartet created an atmosphere that mixed northeastern sophistication with southern passion. Waiters with trays of reserve champagne and gourmet canapes circulated among guests dressed with the discreet elegance of old money and the ostentatious shine of new money. Adelaide descended the stairs feeling like an imposter. The ruby dress adapted to her body as if it had been created specifically for her, but the sensation of not belonging to this world of privileges and social connections was overwhelming. Several curious glances were directed at her. Who was this unknown woman coming down the main staircase, and not the service one? But none as intense as Griffin's, who interrupted his conversation with a group of entrepreneurs to contemplate her with such evident admiration that it provoked murmurs among the guests. "You look," he began as he approached, but seemed to run out of adequate words. "Different," she completed with a nervous smile, almost unrecognizable without the tray of canapes. Griffin's laugh, genuine and warm, attracted more curious glances. "Much more than different. You look exactly as I imagined when I chose that dress, like a perfect wine, intense, complex, impossible to forget once tasted." Something in his words, in the way he looked at her, momentarily dispelled Adelaide's doubts. Perhaps this, whatever this was, wasn't as impossible as she had believed. Perhaps the abyss between their worlds wasn't as unbridgeable as she had supposed. But then Sloane appeared, resplendent in a designer black dress that seemed like a second skin, her expression a mask of social courtesy that failed to completely conceal the fury burning in her green eyes. "Griffin, darling, the Winthrops just arrived. They're anxious to congratulate us," she said, linking her arm with his in a possessive gesture that was as much a declaration of war as a desperate plea. "I'll greet them in a moment," he responded firmly, unlinking his arm with a gentleness that didn't mitigate the rejection. "But there will be no engagement congratulations tonight, Sloane. I believe I was clear on that matter." The New Yorker's face contracted in an expression of barely contained fury. "This is because of her, isn't it?" she hissed, shooting a venomous look at Adelaide. "Because of this Southern hick with delusions of grandeur. This is because of me," Griffin responded, with a calm that was more intimidating than any outburst. "For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what I want, not what's expected of me. And I suggest you maintain your composure during the party, or I'll have to ask you to leave." The veiled threat hung in the air as Griffin moved away to attend to other guests, leaving the two women in a silent duel of gazes. "Don't think you've won," murmured Sloane, coming so close that only Adelaide could hear her. "I've known Griffin for 10 years. His whims are passing. When he tires of playing at forbidden love with the maid, he'll come crawling back to what really suits him." "Perhaps you don't know Griffin as well as you think," Adelaide responded, surprising herself with her own serenity. "The man you describe isn't the same one who spent 3 years trying to return a house to a family he didn't even know, simply because it was the right thing to do." Something in her words seemed to momentarily destabilize Sloane, as if she had touched an uncomfortable truth, but she quickly recovered her mask of aristocratic disdain. "Enjoy your moment of glory, Southern girl. It won't last." And with that, she walked away, her black dress flowing like spilled ink among the guests. The party continued its course, reaching that point of the night when conversations flow more freely, laughter becomes louder, and intentions more transparent under the effect of alcohol and music. Adelaide found herself surprisingly comfortable conversing with artists, architects, and local entrepreneurs who seemed refreshed by her direct perspective and genuine knowledge of the region. When the clock struck 11, Griffin ascended to the small improvised stage in the center of the courtyard. An expectant silence settled among the guests. Sloane, strategically positioned near him, smiled with a confidence that contradicted the afternoon's events, as if she were certain that, when the crucial moment arrived, Griffin wouldn't dare break with expectations. "Friends, colleagues, thank you for joining me tonight," he began, his voice resonating clearly in the Vermont courtyard. "As you know, I've gathered you to share an important announcement." Anticipatory murmurs ran through the audience. Some glances were directed at Sloane, others at Adelaide, who remained discreet but visible in a corner of the courtyard. "For years, I've built my company following principles I believed immovable: efficiency, profitability, constant growth. But recently I've understood that there are more important values." He paused, his eyes briefly finding Adelaide's before continuing. "Tonight I want to present my new project, Magnolia Haven Restoration, a program to identify historic properties fraudulently acquired during the recession and return them to their rightful owners, while creating sustainable jobs and preserving the cultural heritage of the South." A stunned silence greeted his words. It wasn't the engagement announcement many expected. It was something much more radical, much more personal, a public declaration of values that contradicted the image of the ruthless northeastern businessman many had of him. Adelaide felt her heart might burst with pride and emotion. It wasn't just that he was making public his gesture toward her and her family. It was that he was extending that justice to others, transforming a personal story of reparation into a project that could change lives. But then, just as Griffin was explaining the details of the project, Sloane climbed onto the stage with the studied grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. With a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she took the microphone. "What a wonderful initiative, darling. Always so concerned about the less fortunate," she exclaimed, her honeyed voice dripping false admiration. "But don't be modest. Tell them also about our engagement, about how Edmund Harrington's daughter, the very man who orchestrated some of those fraudulent sales, will now be your wife in an ironic twist of fate." The silence that followed was absolute. Guests looked alternately at Griffin, Sloane, and Adelaide, who felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. Was it possible that everything had been an elaborate charade? That the revelation of the truth, the return of her property, the looks, the almost words of love, were just strategies for a twisted power game between powerful families? Griffin seemed momentarily paralyzed, as if he couldn't believe Sloane's audacity, and in that instant of doubt, of prolonged silence where there should have been an immediate denial, Adelaide felt something fragile and precious breaking inside her. Without waiting for a response, without wanting to hear more lies or half-truths, she turned on her heel and moved away from the courtyard, from the growing murmur of the guests, from the music that now sounded discordant, from the lights that suddenly seemed too bright, too false. In the solitude of her room, while hastily removing the ruby dress that now seemed a symbol of her own naivety, she made a decision. The offer letter for the position in Charleston still lay on her nightstand. It was time to leave behind Hemlock Estate, Griffin Blackwood, and this entire story that had begun as a search for justice and ended in confusion and pain. With hands trembling from anger and disappointment, she began to pack her few belongings, including the photo of her grandmother, in front of the house that now, ironically, legally belonged to her, but felt more distant than ever. The knocking on the door was so insistent that Adelaide could almost feel the wood vibrate. She ignored it, methodically continuing with her packing. Another series of knocks, even more urgent. "Adelaide, please, I need to explain." Griffin's voice, usually controlled, sounded hoarse, almost desperate. She continued, ignoring him as she carefully folded the blouse she had worn the day she arrived at Hemlock Estate, closing a perfect circle of disappointment. "If you don't open, I'll break down this door, and we both know I can afford to replace it." Something in his tone, a mixture of determination and self-critical humor, made her pause. With a sigh of resignation, she approached the door and opened it suddenly. Griffin stood there, his designer suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled as if he had repeatedly run his hands through it. He seemed to have aged 10 years in an hour. 5 minutes, Adelaide granted, crossing her arms in a defensive posture. although I doubt there's anything you can say that would change the obvious." He entered the room, observing with alarm the half-packed suitcase on the bed. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. "Brilliant deduction for a businessman of your caliber," she responded, sarcasm as a shield for her vulnerability. "I'm not going to marry Sloane," he said directly, without preambles. "I never had any intention of doing so. Tonight was her last and desperate attempt to force my hand publicly." Adelaide looked at him skeptically. "I didn't see you denying it very energetically on stage." "Because I was momentarily paralyzed by the magnitude of her shamelessness," he admitted, running his hand through his hair again. "By the time I reacted, you had already gone, and I had to spend the next 20 minutes publicly denying her announcement and asking her to leave the party." Something in the frankness of his gaze, in the vulnerability of his posture, began to crack Adelaide's defenses. But she wasn't willing to surrender so easily. "And why should I believe you? All this could simply be the continuation of some elaborate northeastern plan to what, Adelaide?" he interrupted gently. "To return the property that legally belongs to you? To create a project that will potentially cost me millions and earn me the enmity of half the American real estate elite? To fall in love with the most stubborn, proud, and magnificently irritating woman I've ever known?" The word love floated in the air between them, as real and tangible as the walls of the room. "Don't play with that," she warned, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not playing," he responded, taking a step closer. "And to prove it, I have something to show you." From his inner pocket he extracted a small object that Adelaide recognized with a start, an old silver locket with intricate filigree designs, the same one her grandmother always wore around her neck, containing a tiny photograph of her grandfather and a lock of his hair. "How?" Her voice broke at the sight of that family treasure she believed lost forever. "I found it among the belongings the bank foreclosed along with the house," explained Griffin. "I've kept it for 3 years, hoping to find its rightful owner. You, Adelaide." With trembling fingers, she took the locket, opening it to confirm that it indeed contained the faded photo of her grandfather and the lock of grey hair. The tears she had stoically contained began to flow freely down her cheeks. "I could have given it to you on the first day," he continued, his voice soft as a caress. "I could have told you the truth from the beginning, but I needed to know who you really were, not the avenging granddaughter who arrived with false documents and plans for justice, but the woman behind that mission." He took another step closer, entering her personal space but still not touching her. "And what I discovered was much more valuable than any property. A woman of unshakable principles, deep loyalties, intense passions that she tries to hide under layers of pragmatism. Like me. My southern reflection. My perfect complement." Adelaide closed the locket, pressing it against her chest as if it were an anchor in an emotional storm. She wanted to believe him, desperately, but fear, that old companion of the dispossessed, still whispered warnings in her ear. "We're from worlds too different," she murmured, giving voice to her deepest doubts. "You, the northeastern businessman with an international empire. Me, the southern orphan who has fought for every inch of ground in her life." Griffin smiled, that playful gleam returning to his eyes. "Have you forgotten the photo, Adelaide? The boy from Brownsville, the son of the cleaning woman and the construction worker, who ate mac and cheese 5 days a week and inherited his first suit from a dead cousin." He extended his hands, showing the palms where old calluses could still be seen, silent witnesses of hard work in his youth. "We're not so different. We just took different paths to reach the same place, here, now, face to face with the truth." A silence laden with possibilities settled between them. Outside, the party continued, murmurs and music floating in the Vermont night like a backdrop for the intimate drama unfolding in that small room. "Give me one reason," Adelaide finally said, her voice firm despite the tears. "One single reason to stay that isn't Magnolia Haven, nor justice nor reparation." Griffin didn't hesitate. With the decision of someone who finally finds clarity after years of fog, he responded, "Because when you organize my books alphabetically, knowing it drives me crazy. When you deliberately spill water near my chair, when you question each of my decisions as if you were my equal and not my employee. Those are the moments when I feel truly alive, and I suspect from the gleam in your eyes that the same happens to you." The brutal honesty of his response disarmed Adelaide's last defenses, because it was true. Those daily little battles, those constant challenges, had been the most stimulating, the most authentic thing she had experienced in years. "Stay," he asked, finally extending his hand to her, not as an order, but as an invitation. "Not as an employee, not as a beneficiary of my project. As my equal, my accomplice, my—" "Your what?" she pressed, needing to hear the exact words. "My partner," he completed, "in everything. In business, if you want. In life, definitely. In this strange, improbable, wonderful story we've begun to write together." Adelaide contemplated the extended hand, feeling that she was at a vital crossroads. She could take the safe path, accept the deed to Magnolia Haven, the position in Charleston, an ordered and predictable life away from this man who had stirred her emotions like a hurricane. Or she could leap into the void. With a gesture that contained all the southern audacity running through her veins, she ignored Griffin's extended hand and instead took a step forward, eliminating the distance between them, her eyes, now dry and bright with determination, fixed on his. "I won't be your partner, Griffin Blackwood," she declared firmly. "That word is too tepid for what exists between us. If I stay, it will be as your equal in every sense, your associate, your accomplice, your lover, your permanent contradiction, but never ever your subordinate or your charity project." A slow smile of genuine admiration spread across Griffin's face. "I expected nothing less from you, Adelaide Montgomery. I accept your terms without reservations." And then, for the first time without an audience, without an immediate crisis, without the drama of a recent revelation, their lips met in a kiss that sealed that extraordinary pact between two prides that finally found their perfect complement. The morning after the party, Hemlock Estate dawned unusually silent. The echoes of music and conversations had vanished, leaving behind only the physical traces of the celebration: empty glasses, crumpled napkins, wilted petals on the courtyard tiles. Adelaide observed the scene from the upper terrace, a steaming cup of coffee between her hands and equally warm and complex thoughts in her mind. The decision was made. The kiss had sealed a pact between two stubborn souls, but the practical details of that improbable union still floated in the air like dust particles in a ray of Vermont sunlight. "Good morning." Griffin's voice, unusually soft, drew her from her reflections. He wore casual clothes, jeans and a white linen shirt that made him seem more accessible, more human than the impeccably suited businessman. "May I?" He gestured to the chair beside her, and Adelaide nodded with a smile that still contained traces of uncertainty. They sat in silence for a few minutes, contemplating the green mountains that shimmered in the distance like a liquid promise. "What are you thinking about?" he finally asked. "Paths," she responded, surprising herself with the immediate honesty. "About how sometimes we go so focused on looking at our feet, following the traced route, that we don't see there are side trails that could lead us to more interesting places." Griffin nodded, understanding the metaphor without need for explanations. "My path was always straight and steep. From Brownsville to the business peaks, no detours, no concessions, until you arrived." Their fingers brushed on the table, a light but electrifying contact that still surprised them both. "And now what?" asked Adelaide, verbalizing the practical question that floated between them. "How does this work? The ex-housekeeper and the real estate magnate? Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, not a viable relationship." Griffin's laugh, frank and warm, dissipated part of the tension, or the beginning of something revolutionary. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I have a proposal. Not as your boss, not as your whatever we are now. As someone who believes in your capability as much as in mine." "I'm listening," she responded, intrigued. "Magnolia Haven Restoration needs an executive director," he explained, his professional tone mixing with personal enthusiasm. "Someone with deep knowledge of the South, local connections, sensitivity to family histories, and a visceral understanding of what it means to lose a home. Someone like you, Adelaide." The proposal left her momentarily speechless. It wasn't charity, she realized immediately. It was a genuine appreciation of her capabilities, an opportunity to transform her personal experience into something greater that would benefit others. "But I don't have experience in business management," she objected, more from honesty than from genuine reluctance. My background is in history and cultural heritage, not finance. Exactly why you're perfect, he insisted. I bring the business structure, you the soul of the project. Together, perfect balance. The idea began to take root in Adelaide's mind, flowering with possibilities she had never contemplated, not just recovering her own heritage, but helping others recover theirs. Not just finding personal justice, but creating it for dozens, perhaps hundreds of families. And us? She asked, referring to the personal dimension that now inextricably intertwined with the professional. How do we separate this from work? Griffin reflected for a moment, his face acquiring that expression of concentration she had learned to recognize when he faced a complex challenge. I don't think we should separate it completely, he finally responded. It's part of our strength, of our story. But yes, establish boundaries, spaces, Hemlock Estate for personal life, offices in Savannah for the project, and time, Adelaide. Give ourselves time for this, whatever it is, to grow at its own pace. The sensibility of his approach pleasantly surprised her. She had expected northeastern impatience, business efficiency applied even to feelings. Instead, she found a mature understanding that what's valuable requires time to fully develop. I accept, she finally said, extending her hand in a formal gesture that contained an undercurrent of private joke. Associate, executive director, and whatever time determines we should be. He shook her hand with a seriousness that contradicted the playful gleam in his eyes. Deal, Miss Montgomery, though I should warn you that I'm known for my tenacity in pursuing long-term goals. And I for my resistance to being an easy target, Mr. Blackwood, she replied with a challenging smile. The pact was sealed, but both knew the journey was just beginning. A journey that, like the one winding through southern magnolias and northern hemlocks, promised unexpected curves, challenging slopes, and breathtaking views. That same afternoon, while Adelaide was packing, no longer to flee, but to temporarily relocate to Savannah and begin organizing the new project office, she found on her bed a small carved mahogany box. Inside, an antique wrought iron key and a note. So you can always return. To Hemlock Estate. To me. G. The simplicity of the gesture, the depth of its meaning moved her more than any grand declaration. It was a promise of autonomy within connection, of freedom within the nascent commitment, of respect for who she fundamentally was, a woman who needed her own space as much as she needed this new, unexpected, wonderful possibility of companionship. She tucked the key in her jacket pocket, close to her heart, and continued packing with renewed determination. The future opened before her like a blank canvas, ready to be painted with colors she didn't even know existed just a few months ago. Savannah in Autumn was a visual poem that no Faulkner could have completely captured. The golden and coppery tones of the trees in Forsyth Park contrasted with the deep blue of the southern sky, while the sun cast an amber light that seemed to transform the historic mansions on Bull Street into liquid jewels on the hill. Adelaide contemplated this spectacle from the window of the small office Griffin had rented in a historic building in the historic district. 3 weeks had passed since her departure from Hemlock Estate. 3 weeks of intense work, meetings with lawyers and affected families, dusty archives and heartbreaking testimonies. 3 weeks also of nightly calls that began as professional updates and invariably drifted toward more personal, more intimate territories. The Harrington firm has filed a countersuit, informed Harper, now officially hired as the project's legal advisor, as she entered with a stack of documents. They allege we're defaming their corporate reputation. Adelaide smiled without humor. As expected, Sloan wouldn't surrender without a fight. Speaking of fights, Harper placed the documents on the desk and sat across from her with that expression that heralded a personal conversation. How's your particular battle between reason and heart going? Or should I say between Savannah and Vermont? Adelaide sighed, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability with her lifelong friend. It's complicated. The project is advancing extraordinarily well. We already have 15 documented cases of families who lost their properties under suspicious circumstances. 5 with real possibilities of restitution. I didn't ask about the project, Addie, Harper interrupted her gently. I asked about you and that stubborn northeasterner who calls 3 times a day with increasingly elaborate excuses about urgent project matters. An involuntary blush colored Adelaide's cheeks. It was true. Griffin found professional pretexts to maintain constant contact, and she, to her own surprise, awaited them with an anticipation that bordered on the adolescent. "We're getting to know each other," she finally responded, "giving ourselves time as we agreed." Harper looked at her with that affectionate skepticism of someone who knows their interlocutor too well. "And that's the reason why you sigh every time your phone rings. Why I've caught you twice looking at flights to Vermont. Why you mention Griffin approximately 15 times in each conversation." Before Adelaide could formulate a defensive response, the office door suddenly opened. Lucille, the young receptionist, entered with an expression of alarm. "Miss Montgomery, there's a problem. A group of men is trying to enter Magnolia Haven. Mrs. Johnson from the store across the street just called." Adelaide's heart skipped a beat. Magnolia Haven, her grandmother's house, now legally hers, had remained closed since its recovery. She had planned to restore it gradually, perhaps transform it into a small museum about the history of expropriations during the recession, but she hadn't had time to deal with it, focused on helping others recover their properties. "Men? What kind of men?" she asked, already grabbing her purse and coat. "They look like workers, with tools." "And there's an excavator," explained Lucille, nervous. "Mrs. Johnson says they have papers, but she doesn't know if they're legitimate." Harper and Adelaide exchanged an alarmed look. "Harrington," they pronounced in unison. The taxi crossed the narrow streets of Savannah at a speed that in other circumstances would have seemed reckless. Adelaide felt her pulse pounding in her temples. Could it be that Sloane had gone so far in her revenge? That she was attempting an illegal demolition, taking advantage of some legal loophole? When they finally arrived at the street where Magnolia Haven was located, the scene they found wasn't exactly what they expected. Yes, there were workers. Yes, there was a small excavator. But instead of demolishing, they seemed to be restoring, cleaning the abandoned garden, repairing the crumbling roof, reconstructing the small central fountain that had been her grandmother's pride. And supervising it all, giving instructions with the precision of a conductor, was Griffin Blackwood. "What does this mean?" asked Adelaide, too confused to decide whether she should be furious or moved. Griffin turned at the sound of her voice, and the smile that illuminated his face was like a sunrise in the middle of a Savannah noon. "Surprise ruined, I guess," he responded, approaching with that mixture of confidence and vulnerability that she had come to associate exclusively with him. "I wanted to have it ready before showing it to you." "Have what ready?" "Exactly," she insisted, trying to maintain her indignation despite the treacherous flutter in her stomach. "This is my house, Griffin. You can't just show up and decide what to do with it without consulting me." "Technically, I'm consulting you now," he replied, with that spark of provocation that had characterized their first interactions. "I simply reversed the usual order. Action first, permission later." Their northeastern approach to problem-solving. Harper, who observed the scene with a mixture of amusement and exasperation, muttered something about checking the permits and discreetly moved away, leaving them alone amidst the organized chaos of the restoration. "Explain yourself," demanded Adelaide, crossing her arms but unable to prevent her eyes from scanning the already visible improvements to the property. "I found old photographs in the municipal archives, talked to neighbors who knew it in its splendor, hired the best local artisans for a faithful historical restoration." He paused before adding, "I wanted to give you something money can't buy. The recovered past, memories made tangible again." Emotion threatened to overwhelm her as her eyes traveled over details that effectively replicated with astonishing precision her childhood memories. The exact color of the stucco, the pots of Carolina jasmine at the windows, even the hydraulic tiles of the patio she believed lost forever. Griffin adopted a more serious tone, understanding the emotional importance of the place for her. "I've spent the last 3 weeks investigating how this house originally was, Adelaide." "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I miss you," he responded with an honesty that eliminated all pretense. "Because 3 weeks without your insults disguised as observations, without your defiant gaze, without your presence that alters everything established in my life, have been the longest 3 weeks I can remember." He took a step toward her, shortening the physical distance while tearing down the last emotional barriers with each word. "Because each family we helped through the project reminds me why I admired you from the beginning. Your tenacity, your sense of justice, your ability to transform pain into positive action. Another step, and now they were so close she could detect the subtle citrus aroma of his cologne mixing with the scent of moist earth from the freshly excavated garden. And because I understood something fundamental, I don't just want to return your house to you, Adelaide. I want to build a home with you, here in Vermont, wherever. A place not defined by walls and roofs, but by what we are when we're together. The words pierced through all of Adelaide's defenses, all the doubts and fears accumulated during years of losses and disappointments. This man, this irritating and wonderful Northeasterner, who had entered her life as an antagonist and transformed into something completely unexpected, was offering her not just her recovered past, but a shared future. "You continue making decisions without consulting me," she observed, but the smile beginning to form on her lips contradicted the criticism. "An incorrigible Northeastern flaw, I suppose. And you continue questioning each of my initiatives," he replied, now smiling openly. "An equally impossible to eradicate Southern trait. It seems we're destined to irritate each other for the rest of our lives." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, allowing the distance between them to reduce to millimeters. "It's a certainty, Miss Montgomery," he responded before closing the distance with a kiss that tasted of promises, of future, of home. Around them, the workers continued their labor, transforming ruins into renovation, abandonment into care, the painful past into possibility. Like themselves, thought Adelaide as she surrendered to the kiss, Magnolia Haven was experiencing a rebirth that no one would have believed possible months ago. The news arrived like summer storms in Savannah, unexpected, violent, transforming the clear sky into chaos in a matter of minutes. Adelaide was in the office, reviewing the case of a family of farmers from Alabama whose peach orchard had been acquired under circumstances suspiciously similar to those of Magnolia Haven, when Harper entered without knocking. Her usually serene face contracted in a grimace of concern. "We have a problem," she announced, placing a legal document on the desk. "Sloane Harrington has filed a formal lawsuit against the project, and against you personally." Adelaide quickly scanned the document, the technical words dissolving into a simple but alarming essence. Sloane alleged that Magnolia Haven Restoration was a fraudulent enterprise designed to extort legitimate real estate companies, and that Adelaide had manipulated Griffin to obtain personal benefits using their intimate relationship as leverage. "This is absurd," she murmured, but felt a shiver run down her spine. "We don't have an intimate relationship. We haven't even—" She stopped, uncomfortable about expressing aloud the exact nature of what she shared with Griffin. A deep connection, passionate kisses, tentative plans, but not yet the complete physical intimacy that both seemed to be postponing as a precious promise saved for the right moment. "I know," Harper nodded, understanding. "But Sloane is playing dirty. She's leaked rumors to the press about a Southern gold digger who seduced the unsuspecting Northeastern businessman to take over his fortune." Adelaide felt a sudden nausea, not because of the accusations themselves, which were as ridiculous as they were malicious, but at the idea that Griffin might be professionally affected by his association with her. "I need to talk to him," she said, already reaching for her phone. But before she could dial, the device rang in her hand. It was Lucille, her voice trembling with excitement. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Blackwood is here, and he's not alone." Indeed, when Adelaide came out to the reception area, she found Griffin accompanied by an older man of distinguished appearance, whom she immediately recognized as Harrison Covington, one of the most respected attorneys in America, known for having successfully defended victims of bank fraud during the recession. "I suppose you've already received the news," Griffin said by way of greeting, his face a mask of contrasted determination. There was no trace of the playful man who had kissed her among the works of Magnolia Haven just 3 days earlier. "Sloane's lawsuit," confirmed Adelaide. "I was about to call you. Let's talk in private," he suggested, pointing toward her office. Once inside, with the door closed and Harrison Covington seated across from them like a silent referee, Griffin finally allowed his professional composure to crack, revealing the barely contained fury underneath. "This has gone too far," he said, his northeastern accent intensifying with emotion as it always did. "One thing is to attack me or my companies, I'm used to that, but to defame your reputation, to try to destroy this project that's helping real families—" This is unforgivable. Adelaide had never seen him so affected, so personally offended. It was as if Sloane had crossed an invisible line that transformed a business conflict into a moral affront. "I'm not concerned about the rumors about me," she said, trying to calm him. "I'm concerned about how this will affect the project, the families who have placed their hopes in us. And I'm concerned about how it will affect you," he insisted, his eyes seeking hers with an intensity that expressed more than any declaration. "I won't allow you to suffer because of me, because of my past with Sloane." "Excuse the interruption," intervened Harrison Covington, his calm but authoritative voice cutting through the emotional tension. "But I think we should focus on the legal aspects. Miss Harrington has committed several strategic errors in her lawsuit that we can use to our advantage." During the next hour, the attorney methodically explained how to transform the threat into an opportunity. Sloane's lawsuit, formulated more from emotional revenge than legal strategy, contained accusations that were not only demonstrably false, but opened the door to a countersuit for defamation that could prove devastating for the Harringtons. "What we need," concluded Covington, "is complete documentation of all properties acquired by Harrington Enterprises during the recession. If we can demonstrate a systematic pattern of fraudulent acquisitions, we not only discredit her lawsuit, but could force a formal investigation that would put Magnolia Haven Restoration on the national map as defenders of real estate justice." Adelaide and Griffin exchanged a look of mutual recognition. This wasn't just about defending themselves from Sloane. It was the opportunity to exponentially expand the impact of their project, to convert a personal conflict into a broader social cause. "I have contacts at the Georgia Property Registry," offered Adelaide, her mind already working on practical solutions. "And Harper knows several investigative journalists who have followed similar cases. And I can provide unlimited resources," added Griffin. "Personnel, access to private databases, whatever necessary." Covington nodded, satisfied with the coordinated response. "Excellent. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the countersuit, but I must warn you, this will get ugly before it gets better. Miss Harrington has powerful connections, and she'll use all means at her disposal, legal or not, to discredit you." When the attorney left to make some calls, Adelaide and Griffin remained alone in the office, the gravity of the situation settling between them like dust after an explosion. "I'm sorry," he finally said, running a hand through his hair in that gesture she had come to associate with his vulnerability. "I should never have involved you in this. It's my battle, not yours." Adelaide moved closer, taking his hand in a gesture that surprised them both with its naturalness. "You're wrong, Griffin. This was always my battle. Since my grandmother lost Magnolia Haven, since I decided I wouldn't rest until I found justice, you simply helped me expand my vision, to transform a personal revenge into something larger and more valuable." The way he looked at her then, with admiration, with respect, with something deeper they still didn't openly name, made all the doubts, all the fears about what would come dissipate like morning mist under the southern sun. "Besides," she added with a challenging smile that recaptured the spirit of their first exchanges at Hemlock Estate, "no New York aristocrat is going to intimidate a Savannah girl raised in Ardsley Park. Let her try." Griffin's laugh, that genuine laugh he so rarely shared with the world, filled the small office. "Sloane doesn't know who she's messed with, does she?" "No idea," confirmed Adelaide, feeling a fierce determination grow within her. "But she's about to find out." That afternoon, while developing a strategy with Harper and the expanded legal team, Adelaide understood something fundamental. Sloane's threat, instead of separating or weakening them, had solidified their connection in a way that months of working together hadn't achieved. Faced with adversity, they had instinctively closed ranks, recognizing in each other not just a strategic ally, but a complementary emotional fortress. And as she watched Griffin directing the meeting with that mixture of relentless determination and consideration for each opinion that made him a natural leader, Adelaide finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding naming for weeks. She was in love with him, completely, irreversibly in love with this complex northeastern man who had entered her life as an antagonist and transformed into her perfect complement. The revelation didn't terrify her as she would have expected. On the contrary, she felt a curious calm, as if a final piece fit into a long, incomplete puzzle, and with that calm came a certainty. Together, they were stronger than any threat Sloane could launch against them. "Are you okay?" Griffin asked, noticing her momentary distraction. Adelaide smiled, a smile that contained her newly accepted truth. "Better than okay," she responded. "I'm ready for battle." And she was, in more ways than he could imagine. The strategy unfolded like a perfectly rehearsed choreography. During the following 2 weeks, while the sensationalist press delighted in the rumors leaked by Sloan about the scandalous affair between the northeastern businessman and his southern employee, the Magnolia Haven restoration team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, accumulating evidence, connecting cases, building an impenetrable network of proof that would convert Sloan's personal attack into a devastating boomerang. Adelaide barely slept. Her days passed among dusty archives and heartbreaking testimonies of defrauded families. Her nights, analyzing documents alongside Griffin in the small conference room they had converted into an operations center. Fatigue accumulated in her bones, but so did a fierce determination that grew with each new piece of evidence discovered. "We have enough," announced Covington on a rainy night, his usual composure replaced by barely contained excitement. Not just to dismiss her lawsuit, but to present a federal case against Harrington Enterprises for systematic fraud. He spread on the table a map of the southern states where they had marked with red pins each property suspiciously acquired by the company during the recession. The pattern was undeniable, a concentration that revealed a deliberate strategy, not isolated coincidences. "It's time," said Griffin, his voice tinged with that dangerous calm that Adelaide had learned to recognize as the prelude to decisive actions. "We'll file our countersuit tomorrow and simultaneously convene a press conference to make the entire case public." It was the perfect move, bold, relentless, definitive, exactly what Adelaide would have expected from him. However, when everyone had left and they remained alone in the office with only the sound of rain beating against the windows, something in Griffin's expression alerted her, a shadow that didn't fit with the imminent triumph. "What's wrong?" she asked, approaching where he stood by the window, contemplating the rain-soaked streets of Savannah. "This will destroy the Harringtons," he responded without turning. "Not just Sloan, but her father, the entire company." "And that concerns you?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "After what they've done, to so many families, to my grandmother, to us." Griffin finally turned to her, and the vulnerability in his gaze left her momentarily speechless. "It concerns me not because of them, but because of me, because of what it says about me. I don't understand." With a tired sigh, he sat on the edge of the desk, his posture revealing an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "When I started in business, I swore I would never be like the men who had taken advantage of my family's poverty, that I would use my success to build, not to destroy." He paused, seeking words to express something deeply personal. "And here I am about to demolish an entire company, to ruin lives, even if they are lives of people who have caused harm." Adelaide understood then the true nature of his dilemma. It wasn't doubt about the justice of their actions, but about the impact on his own identity, on the man he had struggled to be despite his success and power. "Listen," she said, taking his hands in hers, "what we're doing isn't revenge, it's justice. We're not destroying for destruction's sake. We're creating opportunity for hundreds of families to recover what was unjustly taken from them." Their eyes met, and in that moment of perfect connection, Adelaide knew it was time for the final truth between them. No more half-confessions, no more implied feelings. "And do you know why I'm so sure?" she continued, her voice firm despite the emotional vertigo. "Because I've seen you, Griffin. Really seen you. Not the relentless businessman, not the arrogant Northeasterner, but the boy from Brownsville who swore to do good when he had power. The man who spent 3 years seeking justice for a family he didn't even know. The man I've fallen completely in love with, without reservations, against all logic and common sense." The confession hung between them like a precious and fragile crystal. Griffin looked at her with amazement, as if she had pronounced words in a language he thought extinct. "Love," he repeated, the word sounding strange and wonderful on his lips. "Are you sure?" Adelaide smiled, feeling an inexplicable freedom now that the truth was spoken. "As sure as the sun will rise tomorrow over the Savannah River. As sure as the coffee you make is horrible despite your northeastern pretensions. As sure as I've never felt for anyone what I feel when we argue about the organization of books or the proper temperature of sweet tea." Griffin's laugh, that genuine laugh that was like music to her, filled the office, dissipating the tension accumulated during weeks of legal battle. Without words, he drew her to him in an embrace that contained all the answers she needed. "I love you, Adelaide Montgomery," he murmured against her hair. "Probably since the moment you called me a northeastern snob in our first encounter. Definitely since I saw you dancing to southern music under the stars, believing no one was watching." He separated slightly to look into her eyes, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that contradicted the usual force of his gestures. "And you're right. What we do tomorrow isn't destruction, it's reconstruction. For all those families, for us, for the future I want to build with you." "Future?" she repeated, her heart accelerating. "What kind of future do you have in mind exactly?" Griffin's smile turned playful, recovering that provocative spirit that had characterized their first interactions. "One where we argue about the organization of books and the temperature of sweet tea for the next 50 years, minimum." "Sounds exhausting," she joked. "Gloriously exhausting," he confirmed, before sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of truth, of future, of home. The next morning dawned clear, as if the universe itself wanted to offer a perfect setting for the final act of their battle. The conference room of the Savannah Grand Hotel was packed with journalists, legal representatives, and affected families who had come to witness what had been announced as an important revelation about real estate irregularities during the recession. Adelaide, dressed in an olive-green suit that highlighted the amber of her eyes, observed from the side as Griffin, impeccable in his usual dark suit, prepared to face the media. In the front row, Sloane Harrington and her father had attended, probably hoping to discredit any accusation, their faces perfect masks of aristocratic indignation. When Griffin took the podium, however, something in his expression was different. The determination was still there, but also a new serenity, as if he had found a clarity that went beyond the imminent legal victory. "Good morning," he began, his firm voice filling the room. "I've summoned you to make an announcement that will significantly change the real estate landscape in the South." The camera flashes captured every expression, every gesture, as he methodically deployed the accumulated evidence. Documents, testimonies, the systematic pattern of fraudulent acquisitions by Harrington Enterprises. The room went from initial murmuring to absolute silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of a pen frantically sliding over paper. A new beginning for families who lost more than properties. They lost stories, memories, roots. He made a deliberate pause before delivering the final blow. "Therefore, in addition to formally presenting this evidence to the competent authorities, I announce today the creation of the Magnolia Haven Fund for Real Estate Justice, initially endowed with $20 million from my personal assets, dedicated to financing the legal costs of all affected families and the restoration of properties that are legally recovered." The announcement caused a commotion in the room. "But this isn't just about exposing fraud," he continued, his gaze briefly finding Adelaide's, drawing strength from her presence. "It's about reparation, justice." Adelaide herself found herself momentarily breathless. They had discussed creating a fund, but the magnitude of Griffin's personal financial commitment was a surprise even to her. It was not just a legal, but a moral declaration, a commitment that transcended the immediate victory to create systemic change. While reporters bombarded with questions and flashes illuminated the room like lightning, Adelaide observed how Sloane and her father discreetly abandoned the place, their faces now masks of barely disguised defeat. The battle wasn't over, the courts would have the last word, but the court of public opinion had already issued its verdict. When the press conference finally ended, and they could retreat to a private room away from the media frenzy, Griffin seemed simultaneously exhausted and revitalized, like a runner after a particularly challenging marathon. "20 million, commented Adelaide, still processing the magnitude of the commitment. "It's substantial." Griffin smiled, that playful gleam returning to his eyes. "Are you worried I can't afford to invite you to dinner after such a donation?" She gave him a playful tap on the shoulder. "I'm worried you're sacrificing too much for a cause that began as my personal battle." "It's not sacrifice when it's purpose," he responded, suddenly serious. "And it's no longer your personal battle, Adelaide. It's our shared mission. Our first great joint work, I hope of many." The implication of future, of permanence, floated between them like a tangible promise. "Your grandmother was right," added Griffin, taking her hands in his. "When I met her in that hospital, do you know what she told me after insulting me in 3 different dialects?" Adelaide shook her head, intrigued by this unexpected connection to her past. "She said, 'If you really want to do something good with your money, Northeasterner, find my granddaughter. She has my same fire, but better direction.' And she was right. You had better direction, but you needed my momentum. And I had momentum, but I needed your direction." The perfect synthesis of what they had discovered together, that their differences weren't obstacles but complements, that together they formed something more powerful than the sum of their parts, made Adelaide feel a wave of gratitude toward her grandmother, toward the fate or coincidence that had intertwined their paths. "What happens now?" she asked, referring both to the project and to themselves, to that future barely outlined but already felt as inevitable. Griffin's smile widened, transforming his usually serious face into something luminous. "Now, Miss Montgomery, we have a party to attend. A celebration at Magnolia Haven, with all the families we're helping, to mark not the end of something but the beginning of everything." A year later, Magnolia Haven shone under the southern sunset like a jewel recovered from the depths of oblivion. The garden, once abandoned, now flourished with life. Magnolias, jasmine, bougainvillea climbing the whitewashed walls, creating an oasis of color and aroma that lived up to its name. Adelaide walked along the fine gravel paths, occasionally adjusting a flower here, straightening a small sign there. Each plant, each shrub, each tree now had a discreet plaque that told a story. Rose donated by the Mitchell family mobile, house recovered, April 2025. Lemon tree planted in memory of Eleanor Sutton, whose house in Charleston was returned to her grandchildren. Centennial oak transplanted from the Jameson property, symbol of roots that persist. The Garden of Memories, they called it now. A living testimony to the project that had begun as a personal search for justice and had transformed into a movement that, to date, had returned 76 properties to their rightful owners and established legal precedents that resonated beyond the South, throughout America. "It's perfect," said a familiar voice behind her. Griffin, dressed not in his usual formal suit but in a simple white shirt and linen pants, approached with that mixture of confidence and vulnerability that continued to melt her defenses even after a year together. "It's never perfect," she responded, following the pattern of affectionate provocation that had become their private language of affection. "The bougainvillea is invading the jasmine's space. Northeastern order versus southern chaos once again." Griffin's laugh, now a frequent and precious sound, resonated in the twilight garden. "Symbiosis, not invasion," he corrected, encircling her waist with an arm. "Like us." Guests would soon begin arriving for the celebration of the first anniversary of the Magnolia Haven Fund, now administered by an independent foundation that Adelaide directed with passion and meticulousness. Representatives of the benefited families, local authorities, even some national politicians who had supported the reform of real estate laws inspired by their work. "Nervous about your speech?" he asked, knowing her reticence toward public acts, despite having become, almost without intending it, the human face of the movement for real estate justice. "Terrified," she admitted, with a honesty that only he witnessed. "But I'll do it anyway." "As with everything you set your mind to," Griffin nodded with evident pride, "it's one of the reasons I admire you so much. Your courage isn't the absence of fear, but determination despite it." Adelaide rested her head on his shoulder, allowing herself a moment of stillness before the imminent activity. The past year had been an emotional roller coaster of achievements. The expansion of the project, the legal battle against the Harringtons, finally resolved with an agreement that included substantial restitutions and Edmund's resignation from his company. The transformation of Magnolia Haven into a community center and living museum of resistance against real estate fraud. And, of course, her relationship with Griffin, which had evolved from provocations to partnership, from attraction to deep love, from uncertainty to commitment. They now divided their time between Savannah, where the foundation had its headquarters, and Hemlock Estate in Vermont, creating a shared life that intertwined the best of both worlds. "I have something for you," said Griffin, interrupting her reflections. "An anniversary gift though technically our anniversary is tomorrow." From his pocket he extracted a small box of walnut wood, carved with geometric motifs that combined northeastern and southern designs in a harmonic fusion. Inside, on a bed of crimson velvet, rested an antique wrought-iron key. "But I already have the key to Hemlock Estate," she commented, confused. "You gave it to me a year ago." Griffin's smile turned mysterious. "This isn't the key to Hemlock Estate. It's the key to Hope House." "Hope House," she repeated, increasingly intrigued. "A small property halfway between Vermont and Georgia, at a point exactly equidistant between north and south." His eyes shone with a mixture of nervousness and contained emotion. "A new place with no prior history, no burdens from the past. A blank canvas where we can create our own history. Together." The implication was clear. The offer as significant as any formal proposal. Adelaide felt her heart expanding almost painfully within her chest. "Are you asking me to—" She left the question incomplete, needing to hear the exact words. Griffin took her hands in his, the key between them as a tangible symbol of possibility. "I'm asking you to build a home with me, Adelaide, not just physically but in every sense. That we stop dividing our time and our lives between two places and create a space that's completely ours, where neither you are a visitor nor I am. Where we can, perhaps, someday, form a family that isn't defined as northeastern or southern, but simply as ours." Unexpected tears clouded Adelaide's vision. They weren't tears of sadness or uncertainty, but of a joy so pure and complete that it was almost overwhelming. "A family," she repeated, the word evoking images she had never allowed herself to contemplate seriously. "If you want," he nodded, his vulnerability completely exposed. "There's no rush. We can simply start with the house, see how it evolves. But I want you to know that when I imagine you in my future, it's not just as my associate or my partner. It's as the mother of my children, the companion of my entire life, the constant challenger of my best versions." Adelaide's laughter mixed with her tears in an expression of emotion that transcended any simple category. "That's a lot of responsibility for a simple Southern girl," she joked, using humor as she always did when emotion threatened to overwhelm her. "Nothing about you is simple, Adelaide Montgomery," he responded, following her lead as they had learned to do, dancing together in that verbal choreography that was so uniquely theirs. "You are the most complex, frustrating, wonderful, and essential woman I've ever known, and the only answer I want is whether you accept this key, with all it symbolizes." Adelaide looked at the key in her palm, this small metal object that represented a future so vast and promising. A year ago she would have doubted, would have analyzed, would have looked for traps and second intentions. Now, with the wisdom acquired through shared battles and mutual victories, her answer was as simple and clear as the water of southern springs. "I accept it," she said, closing her hand around the key, "with one condition." Griffin arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "Which?" "That you never ever stop provoking me, challenging me, pushing me out of my comfort zone as you've done since day one." The smile that illuminated Griffin's face rivaled the Savannah sunset in splendor. "It's a promise, Miss Montgomery, for life." And as they sealed that pact with a kiss that tasted of future, of possibility, of home, Adelaide thought about how the most unexpected paths sometimes lead to the most perfect destinations. How the man who had entered her life as an enemy had transformed into her essential complement. How the search for justice for the past had blossomed into a promise of future. In the garden around them, the stories of dozens of families who had recovered their legacy intertwined with her own, forming a tapestry of resilience, justice, and hope. Magnolia Haven, once a symbol of loss, was now a testimony of reconstruction. And among the aromas of jasmine and magnolia, under the southern sky that began to sprinkle with stars, Adelaide understood that she had found something much more valuable than the property she had come to reclaim. She had found her purpose, her path, her home in the most unlikely place, the arms of a stubborn northeasterner who had learned to love the South as much as he loved her. "No more provocations, my life," whispered Griffin against her lips, repeating the words he had pronounced during that first public kiss that had changed everything. And Adelaide, with the mischievous smile he so adored, responded, "I hope that's not true. The provocations between us are just beginning, northeasterner. And they'll last a lifetime." The future stretched before them, bright and promising like the flourishing garden that surrounded them, a living testimony that even from the most painful losses, the most beautiful beginnings can be born, if cultivated with determination, justice, and above all, love. Above all,